As global tensions continue to rise, some in Albuquerque are adding to the calls against nuclear weapons. Tamara Lopez shows us a protest today where we heard criticisms of New Mexico's laboratories.
Sunday afternoon, a group of protesters set out with a goal to physically march to Sandia National Labs, but also to call for the end of nuclear weapons.
We have to end nuclear weapons. We have to abolish them. We have no choice.
Bill Tewald is the protest organizer, and he says the war in Ukraine has brought the decades-old concern to the forefront once again.
Well, because of the Ukraine war, the time is ripe to talk about it because nuclear war has been threatened.
And now it appears tensions between the U.S. and China are growing over the war, too. Top Republican congressman and ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner from Ohio, spoke about the concern Sunday on Meet the Press.
The problem with China entering this is because, you've got the West giving weapons to Ukraine. You've got Russia depleting their stores. We obviously, the West together, have an ability to impact Ukraine greater than Russia alone does. There would be an inexhaustible source of weapons if China in its production capacity supported Russia, and that would change the dynamic.
Here at home, the protesters are also concerned.
It is very scary that China would be arming Russia. It's very, very bad for Ukraine, but it's very bad for escalation of the war.
But earlier this week, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Russia is trying to stop the war.
The war which we are trying to stop and which was launched against us using Ukrainian people, of course, it influenced the policy of Russia.
That comment met with laughter at the G20 summit. But the threat of nuclear war is not a laughing matter for the local group of protesters. Tewald says in New Mexico, they want to see our national labs stop developing nuclear weapons.
Of course, Sandia Laboratory, weapons laboratory, is very important to the economy of this area and to the state. However, we believe that their brain power should be put to great use on so many other issues that human beings face.
Tamara Lopez, KOB4.
Hi, good morning. Welcome to That Saturday Show. I'm your host, Tom Dent, and you just saw the Unity March that happened last weekend, and that was Bill Tewald that we had on the show last week. There's going to be another big rally happening March the 18th at the gates of Kirtland Air Force Base, right near the VA at San Mateo and Gibson at 1 o'clock on the 18th. So be there. It's Saturday, but we're recording the show on March the 8th, which also happens to be International Women's Day. And joining me to break this all down and go over the history is my co-host, Laura Dale.
Happy to be here, Tom.
Hi, Laura. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
Another thing many people may not know about, but the hero of the Peace Center is Sally Alice Thompson, and today, in 2021, was proclaimed Sally Alice Thompson Day by the city of Albuquerque. And Sally Alice Thompson was a World War II Navy veteran. She was a longtime teacher here. Her and her husband, Donald, formed the Albuquerque chapter of Veterans for Peace. She has marched across the country a couple of times to get rid of nukes and nuclear energy. She did the peace walk across Russia. She's a philanthropist. She's a raging granny. She does all sorts of amazing things. And she just turned 100 years old. And also a winner of the coveted Dolores Huerta Award, speaking of another powerful woman in New Mexico history. A couple of other announcements is that the annual meeting of the Peace Center for all our members is taking place on March the 25th at the Peace Center, 202 Harvard Southeast at 11 a.m. to 12:30. There's going to be a potluck there. Please check it out, and don't forget to save the date. we have a very interesting show. Eileen and the In-Betweens, who were the featured group when we formed the Human Peace Sign on Johnson Field back in 2017, I think. And they've been at our annual galas a couple of times. They're going to do Wide Open Skies right after I'm done with these announcements. And they're going to be ending the show with This Is How We Show Our Love. Hi, Laura.
Hello, Tom.
How are you?
I am good. I think it's so cool that Sally Alice is. It's all in this one important day for women because she's been such an important woman in our community.
Right, and I know you were busy, and when I asked you to do this, and you said, I'm going to drop everything and make sure I'm here for this program. So let's get into it a little bit. We could talk about history going back in the past forever, patriarchal religions, how they've used their power over women, so many different issues. You can go to China where, what was it? Was it the geishas or the serving women that had their feet tied so much that, their toes and ankles almost broke? I know there's a very good show that a lot of people that are associated with the Peace Center have listened to on KUNM. That's called The Women's Hour with Karen Bosch, and I've heard all sorts of interesting things on there about how it's women's groups that form these groups that break bread together to try to break down the barriers between different opposing groups like Palestine and Israel. Historically, some of the greatest trade routes in the world were managed by women, like the Indus Valley, Mohenjo-Daro, and Hammurabi, with trade routes through the Fertile Crescent, straight to Timbuktu, managed by women. The Iroquois Nation, I guess the males carried out the actions, but actually the elder females made the decision. We've gone from seeing fantastic women in history to women belittled. I know on Carol Boss, I've heard horrible things such as clitoral mutilations in different countries and cultures in Uganda. Do you want to start jumping into this, Laura?
Well, the thing that's always fascinating to me with women's history is how much is excluded, so I don't even know my own history. I mean, we all have to do tremendous amounts of work to dig up what we've actually done in history. But more interesting, but also more painful, is just the ways in which we have been deliberately excluded that are so egregious, like you said, like things like cutting off your genitalia and making your feet so small you can't walk on them, and making your corset so small that you can only give birth twice and then you die from it because you've destroyed your internal organs. So this whole issue of oppression of women is so fascinating to me because ultimately we're all just human beings trying to survive. So how did it get to the point where we were just sort of chattel or currency? And that's always fascinating to me because at certain points in time, women are the archetypal sort of stronger deities or stronger power figures. And we seem to be in this cycle right now that there's a lot of woke young people that I'm really appreciative for. And I think people like you have helped educate over time. But there's also this discomfort because we just lost Roe v. Wade. Like, how completely backwards, 100 years of all kinds of women living and dying and protesting and fighting and all sorts of things to get to that point. And in one fell swoop, it's gone.
And for the first time, we have 4 women in the U.S. Supreme Court, but things have changed around, and there's not exactly female power necessarily being wielded. I mean, we have great new female court justices like Ketanji Jackson Brown, who's the first black female to sit on the Supreme Court. That ground was broken by Sandra Day O'Connor. And you have Elena Kagan, and you have Sonia Sotomayor. But you have people with questionable motives like Amy, what's her name, Coney Barrett. But it's kind of like a stacked activist court and towards more of the right. And there seems to be, with our former president and certain movements on side of one political party to gain white male power back, and we see this with the Roe versus Wade decision. We see this with stuff that's going on with the governors of Texas and Florida. We see this with, what is it, some coalition of at least, 15 to 20 states that are taking the dissolution of Roe v. Wade and putting forward some pretty intense laws about abetting abortions, rewards for reporting people that have had abortions, that are trying to cross state lines to have abortions. And, this is all about female health. And you wonder, like, let's take a European sort of point of view. It's like, what was the place of women back then? There have been a couple of powerful queens of England, for example, but when they're breaking up the fiefdoms, they're making babies they're making sons basically to divide up the family's property and take power that way. But where are women in these roles? Are they just baby making machines for cannon fodder to secure your lands or fight your wars?
Well, I mean, honestly, we decimate populations when there's wars. So we need the baby machines to come back. That's why you had all those propaganda after the Second World War to get women back into the kitchen with the 1950s tiny corseted waists and all of that sort of thing. And, we're back in this whole situation again. We have used up a lot of our population on wartime. The United States now appears to be, I could be wrong, but now appears to be that our motto is to be in war eternally. And so that takes a toll on our population, and that requires a compliant female population, unless they're going to start cloning us, to keep producing the replacements for all of the young men and women that we are going to disappear into these wars. So yes, we are baby makers for sure.
Right, and Laura and I will be back a couple of times to discuss these issues in detail. Right now we're going to go to a video that's produced by Origins out of Ohio State University, the history of International Women's Day. And just to start off with this, I may not have all my facts exactly right, but through all sorts of suffrage, strikes, deaths, the initial International Women's Day or National Women's Day here was pretty much founded around 1909. And if we could have the German poster up, the International Women's Day in Germany was founded March 8th in 1914. And this poster was actually banned for a number of years by the German Empire because I guess they were afraid of any inkling of women trying to take their power back. So let's watch this documentary, and we'll be back to talk in detail.
It was early March when an electronic greeting card dropped into my mailbox. The cover featured a colorful depiction of a young female figure playfully applying lipstick, surrounded by flowers and butterflies, along with the text, "Happy Women's Day." To be honest, I was a bit baffled. The following day, another e-card arrived, this one featuring a photo of a hot pink box filled with matching tulips. This second card also wished me Happy Women's Day, helpfully adding the date March 8th. Only then did I realize that International Women's Day, celebrated worldwide on March 8th, seemed to be emerging as an occasion for private rituals involving greetings, gifts, and flowers, much like Mother's Day. If that is indeed the case, it will be yet another transformation of a holiday that since its inception in the early 20th century has undergone vast changes. The first Women's Day celebration took place in Chicago on May 3, 1908. Organized by the U.S. Socialist Party, it brought together an audience of 1,500 women who demanded economic and political equality, on a day officially dedicated to the female workers' cause. The following year, women gathered in New York for a similar celebration. Inspired by these American initiatives, European socialists soon followed suit. At the International Women's Conference, which preceded the general meeting of the Socialist Second International in Copenhagen in August of 1910, leading German socialists Louise Sitz and Claire Zetkin proposed the establishment of an annual International Women's Day as a strategy to promote equal rights, including suffrage for women. More than 100 female delegates from 17 countries unanimously endorsed the proposal. What would seem a fairly innocuous gesture marked a significant break with socialist tradition. Though ideologically committed to human equality, socialists had long argued that women's liberation would only materialize under socialism, and the only way for working-class women to improve their lot in life was to join working-class men in their struggle. Feminism was seen as a cause for middle and upper-class women with their own class interests in mind. Yet fearful that the feminist demand for female suffrage might attract too many working-class women, socialist leaders decided to embrace it. Still, they insisted that the vote was a means to an end, not an end in itself. On March 18, 1911, on the 40th anniversary of the Paris Commune, International Women's Day was marked for the first time. More than 1 million Austrian, German, Swiss, Polish, Dutch, and Danish women took part in marches and meetings. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire alone witnessed more than 300 demonstrations. In the following years, similar events spread across the European continent. Generally spearheaded by socialist women, demonstrations called for women's rights and female suffrage, and many feminists readily joined their socialist sisters. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 halted much of the international collaboration that had underpinned International Women's Day and sowed deep divisions among socialist women. Some supported national sentiments, while others protested the war and called for working-class unity across national divides. Eventually, many of these women, including Claire Zetkin, would abandon socialist parties who rallied around the war effort and instead embrace communist parties and organizations. Yet if International Women's Day generally floundered during the war years, it was an International Women's Day celebration that ultimately triggered the Russian Revolution. Russian women had first celebrated International Women's Day on March 8th in 1913. 4 years later, on March 8th of 1917, working-class women in St. Petersburg, exasperated by rising food prices and rapidly deteriorating living conditions, led a demonstration calling for an end to war and political autocracy. Once unleashed, their cries for bread and peace could not be quelled. By March 12th, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The events of 1917 in Russia ended up setting the date for the celebration of International Women's Day, not only in Russia, but across the rest of Europe. In 1922, Lenin established International Women's Day as a communist holiday in the new Soviet Union. The same year, Chinese communists began to celebrate it, and after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, it was proclaimed an official holiday. Spanish communists used March 8th of 1936 as the occasion to stage a huge demonstration in Madrid demanding protection of the Spanish Republic against a growing fascist threat. International Women's Day would remain a communist holiday until the end of the 20th century, marked by carefully orchestrated state-sponsored celebration of women's contributions to the state. As women in the United States and across much of Europe gained suffrage in the wake of the First World War, much of the momentum for International Women's Day celebrations waned. During the interwar years, some European socialists and social democrats continued to mark Women's Day, carefully omitted the term international, to distinguish it from its communist sister celebrations, but events rarely drew substantial crowds. It was only with the emergence of second-wave feminism in the late 1960s that International Women's Day re-emerged as a significant day of activism. Though the day never recaptured much attention among American feminists, European feminists embraced March 8th under the updated name Women's International Day of Struggle, or Frauenkampftag in German, or Kvinnernes Internationale Kampdag in Danish. The new names signal political radicalism and a resolute distance from organized party politics, both of which were key features of the women's movement in the 1970s and 80s. Nonetheless, March 8th celebrations typically involved not only feminists, but a broad assortment of left-wing activists, women's groups, and labor organizations calling for such issues as equal pay, political parity, reproductive rights, and childcare. During the International Women's Year in 1975, the United Nations first celebrated International Women's Day. 2 years later, in 1977, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution proclaiming a United Nations Day for Women's Rights and International Peace. Eager to disentangle this new holiday from the socialist origins of International Women's Day, the Assembly noted that it was to be observed, quote, on any day of the year by member states in accordance with their historical and national traditions, unquote. Moreover, in contrast to contemporary feminist practices of casting it as a day of protest, the United Nations billed it as, quote, a time to reflect on progress made and celebrate acts of courage and determination of ordinary women, unquote. In the decades since the 1977 resolution, the United Nations has in fact marked International Women's Day on March 8th, with events and activities centered around a particular theme such as Empower Rural Women, End Hunger and Poverty, which was the theme in 2012, or Empowering Women, Empowering Humanity, Picture It, the theme of 2015. In spite of such institutionalization of International Women's Day, and in following with its long history of competing traditions, March 8th is now marked in a variety of ways around the world. In many former communist regions, it's a public holiday. In Western Europe, it remains an occasion for feminist demonstrations, and in many developing countries, women's rights activists take to the street to voice their call for gender equality. In Italy, men allegedly give yellow mimosas to women to celebrate the day. And in the United States, some people apparently send cards and flowers to honor the women in their lives.
Yeah, women have come a long way in America. Even I don't like talking about wars, but even back in World War II, they kept everything together at home. They manufactured half of what was used in the wars. My mother drove an ambulance in World War II. And, you know, like we were saying before, so many people have struggled, organized, died, jumped out windows for these causes, for the right to vote. And I believe that the state of Wyoming was the first state to have a female governor, and they were also the first state to give women the vote. And as we were saying before about women's rights coming up with this activist Supreme Court, and a lot of patriarchal kind of megachurch far-right influences would like to take away women's access to health care, abortion, and they're not going to stop there. I mean, we're already seeing inroads in different states where they're banning books, they're attacking trans kids' health rights. Like people are saying, this is a domino effect. They'll come for gay marriages, gay rights, and what we're gonna show next is a beautiful video about female love by Eileen and the In-Betweens.
I belong to the sky. It's wide open skies. It's wide open skies that I belong to. It's wide open skies. It's wide open skies that I belong to.
So I'm going to show a little bit of a slideshow that's sort of forgotten women in history. Some of you may be savvy enough or woke enough to know that some of these people, some of these women, some of these transgender folks. But first I want to talk about just what's interesting in life is there's an amazing book called The History of Fashion and War. And it's all about the ways in which the oppression that fashion has been in terms of sort of boxing women in and closing them into their clothing and their appearance and pleasing the male gaze and all of these sorts of things has also concurrently run with wartime shortages that created things like halter tops and mini skirts and things where you didn't have enough fabric to cover your ankles anymore. And so suddenly women's modesty went out the window, and then you started having these sort of more empowered feminine clothing models and that sort of thing. So history is always sort of crushing women down and then having a war and women getting power again and then crushing them down again. So it's quite a fascinating story. But back to some more positive stuff, I just want to talk about epic historic achievements by women that a lot of people don't know about. So we're going to go to the first slide. Thank you so much. Gladys Bentley, nonconforming icon, one of the earliest sort of known very prominent and very popular performers that refused to adhere to gender norms, loved to wear men's clothing, loved women, loved, she was very extraordinary because she was so influential within her community as a phenomenal performer that no one thought to really, she dealt with a certain amount of persecution, but for the most part, she lived very openly and flamboyantly as herself and was very much accepted within that community, which nowadays we find like, how could that have happened? But it was an extraordinary time, actually, and she was an extraordinary person. Andrée de Jong, she was involved in making sure that Allied airmen who were, entrapped in the war were able to escape. She was really extraordinary in that she managed to rescue, I think about 117 of 600 airmen who were running from the Nazis, who were escaping from them. One of these women who's, we know about Amelia Earhart. We should know about her. She's not taught at all in our schools. Extraordinary, extraordinary woman who did amazing things for Allied forces. Frances Perkins, first woman to serve on the U.S. cabinet. We always tout things like Hillary Clinton and stuff because we've forgotten that there have been these trailblazers, and she was extraordinary with things. Once she got into D.C. and made her voice known, she worked very hard to end child labor. She started the federal minimum wage. She did some extraordinary things that we live with today rather, thoughtlessly in a way. We have no idea the work that went into it and the fighting that she had to do, but it all happened because we were enlightened enough to allow her at this one point in history to serve in the U.S. cabinet.
Yeah, this is the lady that Janet Rankin did her one-woman show at the Pew Center a couple of weeks ago about.
Nice, nice. Ida B. Wells. Everybody knows the NAACP. She was one of the original founding members of it. Just an extraordinary person because suffrage was, as hard as it was as a white woman of privilege, meaning having wealth and some sort of, security, it was so hard for black women, for women of color, to actually exercise these rights. And the extraordinary work that she did, particularly in Chicago, to formulate a strong foundational women's rights movement, African American rights movement, all of that stuff, and with tremendous persecution, tremendous opposition. Extraordinary, extraordinary woman who really should be, her statue should be everywhere. Patsy Mink, first woman of color elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Very, very extraordinary situation. As I understand, it was a big surprise. They weren't expecting her to get in, and she did amazing things for particularly Hawaii, but also for just women's rights, educational. She helped pass the Equal Opportunity and Education Act. She did a lot of stuff that was very groundbreaking. She was not just a token election. She was someone who made dramatic change that we live with today.
Also for women's rights, one thing that people forget, we had the National Organization for Women Albuquerque as a Pajola group at the Pew Center, and Sylvia Ramos did a lot of great work with that. A lot of people know that the Equal Rights Amendment has still not been passed by the U.S. government. And so reinstating Roe versus Wade and, of course, instating the Equal Rights Amendment is very key in the future of women's rights in this country.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that, Tom. Roberta Bobby Gibb, people have thought of Catherine Schweitzer as the woman who really sort of challenged male dominance in running, particularly public running. But it was actually Roberta Bobby Gibb who ran in the Boston Marathon, and she was, they rejected her, and she just did it anyway, and she actually ended up running faster than about half of the male participants are in the race, so I guess there was a reason why they didn't want her in there. Amani Al-Kaktabet, and I'm probably pronouncing it improperly, amazing female media personage who's really, really breaking tremendous ground for Muslim women in terms of the media, getting their stories out, getting them to be much less marginalized, and getting the general population and the general media watching population to consider that women's information, women's news, women's stories are actually major, important international stories that need to be heard. And she's doing an amazing job there with, all really making the kinds of issues that hold Muslim women back becomes something of importance and something that people feel needs to change. Oh, Audre Lorde. Extraordinary, 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 very courageous. I believe, I'm trying to think of one of the good quotes. You can't have you will never dismantle the master's power with the master's tools. I'm misquoting, but extraordinary and very fierce warrior for women, for lesbians, for Black empowerment, for education for the African American community, and just a phenomenal, phenomenal writer. Beulah Henry is actually a really interesting woman. Most people have no idea how many patents she invented or sort of reinvented existing patents so that they became more useful, particularly for women. I think it was about, she's called Lady Edison. And so we've forgotten, because Thomas Edison has basically devoured the market in terms of who we think of as great inventors, that there was this extraordinary person who just quietly in the background was getting, tons and tons of patents and making all kinds of improvements that some of which we do use today in terms of, kitchen things and cooking things and freezers and all kinds of stuff.
And did she get paid accordingly? Probably not.
I think she knew how to handle herself. I think
Good.
she knew how to
Good.
write some good contracts, but probably nothing like the kind of monopoly Edison had. Rosalind Franklin. This one is particularly dear to my heart because she died young. She died in her 30s. And truly, Crick and Watson actually had hit a stalemate. They'd hit a brick wall. They could not fully understand the architecture of the DNA. They knew the basics of how it worked, but they didn't understand the architecture. And this quiet, modest woman in the background had figured it out, and they didn't credit her at all. So they got their Nobel Prize, and the one thing that was the missing link that she provided quietly with no ego, with no intention of being noticed, they didn't bother to credit her at all. So we've been thinking for years, and it's probably if you go to your textbooks in our school system, you're going to read about that Watson and Crick were the ones who founded DNA. And that is just so unfair and so proof of how little credit we as women are given for making history. Then we have Mary McLeod Bethune. There's starting to be a lot more press about her because she was so impactful in the educational world in terms of equality and getting people in disadvantaged communities to sit at the table in Washington and be able to be considered allowed to have the same education as white folks. Tremendous civil rights activist, fought for all kinds of things, but better education was particularly powerful. National Association of Colored Women, she was just one of the reasons we have even the tiny bit of equity that we have in schools for people of color came a lot from her, particularly in Washington. So Katharine Hepburn, I'm a huge, Katharine Hepburn's mother is Kit Hepburn, and she actually helped create Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger had come out here with her incendiary talks about contraceptives, most particularly birth control, which no one had thought about. And Kit Hepburn got behind it. She organized all these kinds of powerful media events. And the very first, a funny bit of trivia, the very first Planned Parenthood in the country, it wasn't called that back then, but it opened in Connecticut, where she was from. And it was picketed from day one. So the history of Planned Parenthood is the history of it being picketed. And yet they went on, her and Sanger went on to open clinics all over the world and to open people's minds to the idea that women actually had autonomy over the sort of baby-making machine that their bodies were considered to be at that point. Last one, Marsha P. Johnson, transgender, tremendous pioneer of refused, no matter what horrific circumstances were directed at her, refused ever to bow down, refused ever to be ashamed of who she was and the kinds of work that she did.
Well, women even put us on the moon, right? Hidden Figures, what was the name of that lady? I'm testing your trivia knowledge.
That one I don't. It's not that I don't remember, it's that I have 1,200 words in and I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong name. Well, but absolutely,
Don't forget Harriet Tubman. Don't forget powerful Native American women that are emerging. Winona LaDuke, our Secretary of the Interior is Deb Haaland from New Mexico. We see very, very powerful women in the entertainment business and sports as well. Serena Williams, greatest woman tennis player that ever lived after Althea Gibson and Chris Evert, Billie Jean King. Billie Jean King went a long way in breaking down male-female barriers, especially for the feminist movement. And what is it? I don't want to put things in capitalistic terms, but Rihanna from the Barbados became the youngest female billionaire in the world.
Right.
And it looks like we're starting to run out of time.
I just wanted to say one more slide. This is Zora Neale Hurston, extraordinary storyteller, but also she actually gets to sit at the Algonquin Round Table back when it was the golden, sort of God's circle of writing. Actually, kind of one of the reasons she's not better known is because she really despised being looked at by her race. And so the black community sort of rejected her a little bit, but she did an extraordinary thing at the end of her life where she went to very small towns all over the South and gathered one of the most extraordinary collections of Deep South slave and plantation songs, which she would memorize and go back and forth and sing to the next person. So one of the great archives of Americana music is actually sitting in some warehouse because of Zora Neale Hurston.
Yeah, when I took Black Women's Writers at UNM, she was the first poet author that we studied.
Their eyes were watching God, just so you know. It's a great book to read.
So thank you very much for being here, Laura. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. We're about to go to our second documentary. That's going to be more epic and historic achievements by women throughout history. And then we'll have our second song by Eileen and the In-Betweens, which is called This Is How We Show Our Love. And we'll be back for season 3, episode 10 next week. In last week's program, I tried to cover so many environmental bills that were up in the state legislature that I was almost babbling, but definitely, fortunately, we're going to have Steve Cabietis back with me next week, so we'll try to do as much as a wrap-up before the session ends, the New Mexico state legislative session. Thanks again, Laura. We'll see you next week on That Saturday Show.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for watching.
American aviatrix Amelia Earhart was born on July 24, 1897, in Atchison, Kansas. Amelia was a rambunctious child, though her mother wanted her to be a proper lady instead of a tomboy.
I can see Amelia growing up and seeing her mother juggling an alcoholic husband, not very much money, and I think throughout her life, Amelia tried to avoid any kind of conventional female life.
After a plane ride at an air show, she decided she would learn to fly. In 1928, she was invited to be the first female to fly across the Atlantic, but only as a passenger. With pilot Bill Stultz and mechanic Louis E. Gordon, Earhart landed in the United Kingdom on June 17, 1928. Amelia was an instant sensation.
I think she was somewhat embarrassed by the attention she got, because as she knew, she had done nothing on this flight. She was just a passenger. She kept the log, but she really referred to herself as a sack of potatoes.
After the flight, promoter George P. Putnam began managing Amelia's career with lecture tours and product endorsements.
People criticized GP for pushing Amelia too hard. Number one, I think she was a willing participant in this. And number two, she really had to do it. That was the way that you would raise the money for these flights.
Though their relationship started out strictly professional, they would eventually marry in 1931. After several more successful flights, including a solo trip across the Atlantic, Earhart decided to fly around the world. Amelia and navigator Fred Noonan took off from Oakland, California on June 1st, 1937, and made it 22,000 miles to Lae, New Guinea.
On Earhart's last flight, having started out with ill health, fatigue, on the way along the flight, she would fly an average very often of 10 to 12 hours a day. So by the time she got to Lae, she was a wreck.
The next leg to Howland Island was problematic. Overcast skies hindered celestial navigation, and it was discovered later they were using inaccurate maps. At 8:43 a.m. on July 3rd, U.S. Coast Guard vessel Ithaca received the last communication from Earhart and launched an immediate search. However, the plane was never found.
It's not the mystery of her disappearance that we want to stress. To her, flying was such a wonderful experience, and she wanted it to be safe. She wanted people to enjoy it as she did.
Wilma Rudolph was one of America's first major national superstars in track.
Wilma Rudolph was born on June 23, 1940, in Tennessee, the 20th of 22 children. At age 4, she contracted polio. Her doctors said she would never walk again, but with physical therapy, leg braces, and true grit, Wilma Rudolph was walking by age 12.
During her high school years, Wilma Rudolph was a great basketball player, and Ed Temple from Tennessee State University saw her, and he saw a lot of potential, not only in basketball, but also in track. He had her work out with the college track team in the summers.
At age 16, Wilma Rudolph won a bronze medal in the 1956 Melbourne Olympic Games for the 4x100 relay. Returning to the U.S., she attended Tennessee State University on a scholarship, where Ed Temple continued her training. 4 years later in the Rome Olympics, along with Wilma, almost the entire U.S. track team consisted of Ed Temple's runners.
She was phenomenal in the 1960 games in Rome. The 2 sprint events she won in blowouts, and she anchored the relay team that had a come-from-behind victory to win gold as well.
Wilma Rudolph was the first American woman to win 3 gold medals in a single Olympics. She became an overnight sensation.
Wilma Rudolph returned home from the Rome Olympics to a hero's welcome. When she learned that her ticker tape parade was to be segregated, she refused to attend and forced a change.
Wilma Rudolph Day was the first integrated event in municipal history in the city of Clarksville, Tennessee.
Wilma Rudolph was only 22 years old when she retired from competitive sports in 1962.
She decided to go back to Tennessee State University, and she got her degree in teaching, and she became a teacher.
Rudolph would go on to coach track at Indiana's DePaul University, serve as a goodwill ambassador to French West Africa, and raise a family of 4 children.
Wilma Rudolph was inducted into the Black Athletes Hall of Fame in 1973, the National Track Hall of Fame in 1974, and she wrote her own autobiography titled Wilma, which was turned into a TV movie in 1977 called Wilma.
Wilma Rudolph died of brain cancer at the age of 54 on November 12, 1994, in Nashville, Tennessee.
One of the most prestigious awards in women's sports is the Wilma Rudolph Award of Courage, given by the Women's Sports Foundation. Wilma Rudolph is a huge inspiration to me and to many others, and really that is her legacy.
As the first woman appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor was a trailblazer for equal rights.
Sandra Day O'Connor goes down in the history books, but she also proved herself to be a fine jurist in touch with the heartbeat of the American people.
On March 26, 1930, Sandra Day O'Connor was born in El Paso, Texas, and later wrote about how her rugged childhood influenced her in her memoir Lazy Bee, growing up on a cattle ranch in the American Southwest.
Justice O'Connor has always been an example of somebody who worked very hard, spoke the truth as she saw it, and wrote opinions that were clear and simple and to the point.
In 1950, O'Connor graduated from Stanford with a BA in economics and continued to Stanford Law School. After graduating, O'Connor struggled to find work as an attorney and instead worked for free for the county of San Mateo and eventually became the deputy county attorney.
She was, in her illustrious career, a path-breaking woman, a woman who went through a legal career when there was tremendous discrimination against women in the law, when it was unusual to be a woman partner at a firm and definitely a woman judge.
O'Connor continued to serve the public as the Assistant Attorney General in Arizona, and later was appointed to the state Senate. In 1975, O'Connor was elected to the Superior Court before being nominated by President Ronald Reagan as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court in 1981.
President Reagan entered the White House determined to put a woman on the Supreme Court. He really thought it was important, and he also understood politically that it would serve him well because as a politician, he initially did better with men than women, and so there was an element of politics in his deciding to focus on a woman.
Although considered a moderate conservative, O'Connor provided a crucial vote to uphold abortion rights in the case to overturn Roe v. Wade. During the 2000 election of Bush versus Gore, O'Connor again gave a deciding vote when she agreed to uphold Florida's court decision in favor of President George Bush.
O'Connor was never really a legal scholar. She approached every case on the merits, on a case-by-case basis. So sometimes she would weave to the right, sometimes she would weave to the left. And as a result, she became a swing vote, one of the crucial votes that was necessary to achieve a majority opinion.
Due to her husband's failing health, Justice O'Connor retired from court on January 31st, 2006, but continued to remain active as a speaker, author, and educator. In 2009, Sandra Day O'Connor received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. A trailblazer who appeared in more than 300 films, Hattie McDaniel became the first African American to win an Academy Award.
In Hattie McDaniel's Oscar acceptance speech, she said that she hoped to be a credit to her race. And there is no way that you can deny that she was.
Born on June 10, 1895 in Wichita, Kansas, Hattie McDaniel was the youngest of 13 children born to 2 former slaves. While still in high school, McDaniel began performing professionally, and in 1925, she became one of the first African-American women to sing on the radio.
Hattie McDaniel actually started her career as a singer and a dancer on the stage, and she had a quite extensive radio career, both as a singer and as a comedian. So her roles in Hollywood were much more limited than her roles in other media.
After coming to Hollywood in 1931, McDaniel began appearing in small, uncredited roles before landing a major part in John Ford's Judge Priest. McDaniel went on to work in a string of movies with actors such as Jean Harlow, Clark Gable, Jimmy Stewart, and Ginger Rogers.
Hattie McDaniel was a terrific actress and so often relegated down in the credit role, but her performance in many of these movies is the performance that you remember.
In 1939, McDaniel won the role of Mammy in the epic film Gone with the Wind and took home the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. The film earned 10 Oscars and was later ranked by AFI as the 4th greatest American film of all time.
When I started working, me and my fellow actors, we looked at a script and we were wondering what page we would die on. We were always drug dealers, we were mugging somebody. Hattie McDaniel is a historic figure in the film business. If she hadn't done what she did and won the Oscar when she won it, who knows how long it would take us to get to where we are now.
Long ago, arrogant men decided to split the atom, and ever since we've been tasked to put it back together again. Disrupted must be restored piece by piece, floor by floor. she shows her love when the buffalo move as one. This is how they show their love when we sing and we march together. This is how we show our love. When the grandmothers link their arms, this is how they show their love. When we say no more wars, no more weapons, this is how we show our love. When we say no more separating families, this is how we show our love. When we sing and we march together, this is how we show our love. Balance disrupted must be restored, piece by piece, floor by floor. When the clouds cast shadows on the land, this is how they show their love. When we say no more wars, no more weapons, this is how we show our love. When we say no more separating families, this is how we show our love. When we put the atom back together, this is how we show our love.
Until the next time, it's time to say goodbye. When you out here in the streets, keep it real, 505. We love everybody, we just want to let you know. Thanks for tuning in to that Saturday show.